So we are going to get started, and if anybody joins, they join in. My name is Grant Bigman. I'm the Assistant Director for Hillel, Virginia Tech. This is a webinar, not a meeting. So basically what that means is you are going to see myself, Samantha, and Nat through this conversation. There's no way for you to put on your camera. And Nat's going to be obviously talking about Holocaust, but at the end, we would love to have some questions that we can ask him. And so you're going to be able to do that in basically three different ways. There's the chat function on the bottom of the screen, and you can just message the three of us. You can use the Q&A function, which Samantha and I will be monitoring during the conversation. And then the last way is you can actually raise your hand and we can call on you to audibly ask your question aloud. Otherwise, Samantha and I will be asking Nat questions. We hope that you have to take this opportunity. This is a tremendous opportunity to be hosting Nat. And I'm going to let Samantha, who's one of the students, introduce him.
So, hi everyone, my name is Samantha Levy. It's my honor to introduce Mr. Kranowski. He was born in France, but he's lived in the US for most of his life. He's a retired college professor, and he taught the French language and literature and accounting over his career as a professor. In Virginia, he taught French at Hollins University and accounting at Radford. He often speaks to schools, churches, and other groups about his childhood experiences in Nazi-occupied France.
Thank you, Samantha. As a Jewish child, I lived in Nazi-occupied France for the full 4.5 years that France was occupied. And I will, in a few minutes, tell you how this affected my parents and me. But before I do that, I think it would be useful if I gave you the big picture, an overview of the situation of Jews in France. I've spent a lot of time reading, studying, researching what happened to Jews in France during the war. And I want to give you the general picture. When the Nazis invaded France, they had already invaded and taken over 7 other European countries. France's turn to be invaded came on May 10th, 1940. And France resisted for 6 weeks. And even though they had the biggest army in Europe, they were forced to surrender on June 22nd, 1940. A lot has been written as to why, when they had such a good army, they didn't resist longer, but that's not what I'm going to talk about, and it's controversial anyway. At the time that France became occupied, there were somewhere between 300,000 and 350,000 Jews in France. It's hard to know the exact number. For one thing, the French did not ask for religion on the census. And for another, who is a Jew is a very difficult question to answer, as you may know. This number of Jews constituted about 1% of the French population. This is pretty typical of the number of Jews in many other countries. They were typically 1 to 2% of the population, so a very small minority. And about half of the French Jews lived in Paris, just as I did with my family. The Jews of France can be divided into 2 very distinct categories. One category, about 60% of the Jews in France, were very much assimilated. They had lived in France for several generations. Some of the Jewish men had fought with distinction on the side of France in World War I, had the medals to prove it. They spoke French perfectly. The children were born in France. They were just as French as anybody else. You couldn't tell them apart. And they had moved up the scale economically. from working class when the original family members came to France to middle class bourgeoisie. And they were generally economically doing at least fairly well, some very well. They were French citizens. This is an important point. The other 40% were recent arrivals, recent immigrants to France, mostly from Eastern Europe, from Soviet Union, Poland, Latvia, etc., other countries. Poland had the most Jews of any country in Europe. They had 3 million Jews at the start of the war. At the end of the war, they were almost zero. And my parents were Polish Jews, in fact. My name is Polish. Those immigrants, as you can imagine, as recent arrivals, spoke French poorly. Among themselves, they usually spoke Yiddish. That was the lingua franca of European Jews. And they were almost all working class, generally poor. And you could tell at a glance that they were not born in France, that they were foreign, for the reasons I've just said. They tended to live like immigrants of all sorts together in self-styled ghettos, not ghettos in the Nazi sense, but simply that they lived together in a neighborhood. And of course, they were not French citizens. Now, what was the goal of the Nazis with respect to Jews? Well, even though they did not say so outwardly, it's very clear, looking back, what the goal was. It was to arrest, imprison, deport, and kill every Jewish man, woman, and child, period. That was the goal. And I think it was pretty much the goal in every country that they invaded and took over. How did they go about doing this? What were their strategies and policies towards Jews? I'm going to focus on France because that's what I know. First, they permitted a new French government to be formed. The Third Republic had been dissolved, and something called the État français, the French state, was created. We normally refer to it in English speaking as the Vichy Regime, because Vichy, V-I-C-H-Y, was the city where it was headquartered in France, pretty much in the middle of the country, not in Paris, in Vichy, which today we know for seltzer water and spas, but not at the time. The head of Vichy France was a hero of World War I, Marshal Philippe Pétain, who was 84 years old when he became the head of the French state. He was beloved by almost every French person. He still looked very good for 84. He had the skin of a much younger man. He was pretty healthy, and as long as he had his nap in the afternoon, he could function just fine. Why did the Germans allow a French government? Because it suited their purpose. When they had unpleasant announcements or orders to give, they would almost always do it by the intermediary of Marshal Pétain and his government. And since it was a Frenchman who was well loved saying this, it sugared the pill quite a bit. You have to understand that having taken over 7 countries and looking ahead to trying to conquer the British Empire and thinking already about a sneak attack against the Russians, which they weren't yet ready to announce publicly, because it was going to be a sneak attack. Their military was scattered all over the place, and they could not spare too many soldiers or German police to police all the countries. What they did in France is very similar to what they did in other countries about setting up a local government. And it worked very well for the Germans. The Germans wanted to minimize French resistance for the reasons I've just stated. They didn't want the French people revolting or attacking them, and having a French government in charge helped them quite a bit. In order to create their objective with respect to the Jews, they had to find out where the Jews were. Since the French did not ask for religion on their census, the first thing they did was demand that Vichy require all Jews to register at their local police office and to obtain a new identity card. At that time, every person living in France from 16 years old or older had to have an identity card, because a French policeman could stop anybody in the street at any time without any reason and say, "Vos papiers, where are your papers? Show me your ID card." If you didn't have an ID card, you'd be arrested on the spot. And when Jews registered to obtain this identity card, the word juif, J-U-I-F, which means Jew, was prominently stamped in bold red capital letters, like this. This is an example of such a card. You see the word juif at the top. And I have another one which shows that even better. Look at that. That's pretty clear what that says, isn't it? You can't, and this is in black and white, but the word juif is in bold red letters. And photos are in black and white at that time. So it stands out very, very much. If a policeman stopped somebody and saw that, the person would be arrested. Why? Because he was Jewish. There was no other reason. And that was the only reason required. Speaking of being Jewish, I think it would be interesting if I read to you in English translation, I've translated it for you, how a Jew is defined under the Vichy regime. Marshal Pétain in June 1941 signed an edict answering the question, who is a Jew? And I'm going to read what the edict said, not the entire thing, but the relevant passages. Quote, is to be considered a Jew any person, whether belonging to an established religion or not, who has at least 3 grandparents of the Jewish race. Notice the word race, not religion. Or of only 2 such grandparents, if the spouse has 2 grandparents belonging to the Jewish race. Next sentence. Is to be considered a Jew as belonging to the Jewish race any grandparent having adhered to the Jewish religion. Next sentence. Is to be considered a Jew any person who adheres to the Jewish religion and who did so adhere on June 25, 1940. That's the date when the state was created. That's why it's that date. And who has 2 grandparents belonging to the Jewish race. I think it's quite interesting to read this. And if I were to ask Jews today, who is a Jew, you wouldn't get one answer, would you? You would get different answers. It's a complex question. But for the purpose of the Vichy regime, it is important to define a Jew clearly enough so that that person can be identified as being Jewish and legitimately treated that way. And by the way, once Jews understood that they would be arrested and possibly imprisoned for life or worse for being Jewish, a number of them tried to convert to another religion to remain alive and to avoid a bad fate. Well, that didn't work because neither the French nor the Germans recognized conversion. You were a Jew because you came from a Jewish background. It didn't matter whether you belonged to the religion, whether you converted or didn't. That had no effect whatsoever. And people still tried to do that, of course, because they were desperate, but it did not help. Other strategies and tactics of the Germans and the Vichy regime. The Vichy regime created what the Germans call a Judenrat, which means a Jewish council. That's a German expression. And this Jewish council was there as a go-between so that when Vichy asked the Jews to do something, they had a representative group of Jews to talk to who could handle it. It was a convenient tool. The Jewish Council was typically composed of about 20 prominent Jews, French Jews, and at various times, the Germans would ask Vichy to impose fines on the Jews for various infractions, such as shooting a German soldier. And it was the responsibility of the Jewish Council to raise the money from their fellow Jews. Worse, when time came to deport Jews to the East, which was supposed to be for work, but really was to concentration camps and often to death camps, the Jewish Council was often asked to select the names of the number of Jews chosen to be put on trains and taken east. And the third advantage of this Jewish Council was that the Jews were made responsible for their fellow Jews if they no longer had jobs, if they didn't have enough food to eat, if they had health problems. The Jews had to take care of it. The French government had nothing to do with it. And of course, the Germans had nothing to do with it. So it took the burden of responsibility for taking care of Jews entirely off the hands of the French government and of the Germans. So it was very convenient. In June 1942, Vichy, at the request of the Germans, passed a law requiring every Jew 6 years old or over to pin a Jewish star on his outer clothing. You perhaps have heard of that. That's one of the best known features of what happened to Jews. So that anytime Jews went out in public, they were required to be physically identifiable as Jewish because you saw the Jewish star. And if they were Jewish and they didn't wear that star, obviously they would get into trouble with the law. Then other more restrictive laws were passed against Jews. Jews were forbidden to exercise any liberal profession. They could not be teachers, they could not be lawyers, they could not be doctors. And many Jews already were. Usually they were among this first group of Jews I mentioned, the Jews who had been assimilated. It's not a surprise to you, I'm sure, to know that Jews have often been in these professions. So if they already were exercising those professions, they had to give them up. And if they wanted to go into the professions, they could not. Jews also were prevented from owning a business. If they owned a business, they were required to immediately sell it to a so-called Aryan, that is to say, a non-Jew. And as you can imagine, since it was a forced sale, the price was not to the advantage of the seller. So no Jew could own a business anymore. Jews could not shop in stores except for 1 hour a day. It was usually between 4 and 5 p.m. If they shopped at any other time, they were kicked out. In Paris, which has a subway system, they had to be in the last car of the subway train. They could not be in any other car. Jews could not own a radio. If they owned a radio, they had to turn it into the police. If you go back to the 1940s, of course, there were no computers. There were no cell phones. What were the means of communication? Newspapers, radios, mainly. Newspapers were controlled by the state. You didn't have to worry about what they said in the newspapers. Radios were not so easy to control. Radio reception could go across borders. And in fact, General de Gaulle from London appealed to the French in a very famous speech to resist the Germans. And although the Germans and the French tried to prevent that from getting through, they couldn't always succeed. So Jews could not own a radio. They had to get their news from official France or from newspapers controlled by the government. Finally, after about 6 months, starting sometime in 1941, the Germans were ready to begin arresting Jews. They had gotten ready in the various ways I've suggested. But in order, again, to minimize French resistance, the Germans adopted strategies that worked in their favor. First, they had only foreign Jewish men arrested. They were the least likely to be resisted by the general population because they were foreign and they were men. They weren't children, they weren't women. And I should mention that the people who did the arresting were only French police, not Germans. Nobody in a German uniform arrested any Jew. This was, again, to minimize resistance. And I hadn't mentioned this, but the Germans allowed the Vichy government to have a police force because it suited their purpose. They wanted a docile population. They didn't want people revolting and doing things that disrupted the order of things. They wanted a stable French government that suited them. So they allowed the French police to exist. Of course, they didn't have tanks or other heavy weapons. They had sidearms and maybe some other weapons which weren't too strong, just enough so they could maintain order in France. I should also, well, let me continue a little bit before I do this. Once they had begun arresting only foreign Jewish men through the French police, and that went pretty well. There was very little resistance on the part of the French population as a whole. The next step was to begin arresting foreign Jewish women. And that created a little bit more resistance, but not that much. The French had gotten used to Jews being arrested. And the third and final step, which was the trickiest, was to arrest entire Jewish families, including children. Now that created some resistance, but again, they only did this with foreign Jews. They did not arrest Jews who had French nationality. The ones with French nationality, by the way, thought they were safe. They were mistaken. Because once there were no more foreign Jews to arrest, guess who got arrested? The ones who were French citizens. And the way the French did that is anybody who had become naturalized from 1927 on, their naturalization was revoked. And once they were no longer French citizens, they could be arrested with no problem. They never got any further than that because the Germans only occupied France for 4.5 years. Had they been in France longer, I'm convinced they would have eventually arrested every single Jew they could find, whether he was a citizen or not, but they never got to that point. What happened to the Jews who were arrested? Well, there were about 50 concentration camps in France itself, just in France. There were concentration camps all over Western Europe, but I'm talking to you about France, so that's what I'm focusing on. The biggest concentration camp in France was about 10 miles north of Paris. And I'm going to show you the name because I'm going to pronounce it in French because that's the only way I can pronounce it. Drancy, that's how you say it. Drancy. Can you say that? Drancy. When you first saw that, you probably wouldn't have pronounced it like that, I suppose. But that's how I pronounce it because that's the name of the camp. Drancy was the biggest concentration camp in France. It was guarded by French police, not Germans. It had originally been created as a low-cost public housing. It consisted of, I don't know, 4 or 5 apartment buildings, maybe 5 or 6 stories high. This is where all the Jews who were arrested in Paris were sent. And it became the point from which Jews were sent to the death camp of Auschwitz in southern Poland. So if Jews were in other concentration camps, and remember I said there were many others in France, once it was determined that they should be deported to Auschwitz, they were sent to Drancy, and from Drancy, they were put on trains which went to Auschwitz. And I have another, I have a map to show you the route that was taken. All right. If you see the arrow on the left, this is Drancy, which is just north of Paris. And Jews were put on a train which left from there and traveled east all the way across France to the German border, because there's a border between Germany and France. And by the way, French police guarded the train until it got to the German border. When it got to the German border, French police got off, German police got on. And the train continued across all of Germany until it crossed the frontier into Poland, which by then was occupied by Germany. It was one of the first countries that Germany occupied. So the train continued into Poland until it reached Auschwitz. And Auschwitz, which is the German name, by the way, the Polish name was Auschwitzim, which most people don't know because Auschwitz is the name that stuck.
Hey, Nat.
Yeah.
If you flip the map, it's upside down right now.
Oh, is it upside down? Excuse me.
There you go.
It's hard for me to tell. Thank you for telling me that.
It's totally fine.
Yeah, it's going to make a lot more sense this way. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is part of the learning experience here. Thank you for saying that. So now you can see what I'm talking about. There's Drancy. And in red, I indicated the path so that you could see where the train went. The train went, this is the German border right here. It crossed into Germany, went all the way across Germany, and then into Poland, and then went southeast to get to Auschwitz. By the way, Auschwitz, if you know anything about Poland, is located near the city of Krakow, which is one of the major cities of Poland. Krakow in English, Krakow, which is in about 30 miles west of Auschwitz. But the city where Auschwitz was created is a very small city, but obviously it became very well known after the war. This trip took about 2.5 days. The train usually had about 1,000 Jews on each train. 75 trains went from Drancy to Auschwitz beginning in March 1942 until near the end of 1944. So about 75,000 Jews made that trip. Of those 75,000 Jews, about 2,500 survived the war. The others either died of typhus, malnutrition, or in many cases were gassed in the gas chambers at Auschwitz. During this trip, and these were cattle cars, they were not meant for passengers normally. The train was sealed. The doors were locked so that they could not be opened. Inside each car, there was no bathroom because it was a cattle train. Instead, there was one bucket in each car that was for toilet needs. No food was provided, no drink was provided. The trip, as I say, took 2.5 days. And for 2.5 days, sometimes longer, because the train sometimes had to stop for various reasons, the doors were not opened. And the Jews remained in those cars until they got to Auschwitz. When the doors were open in Auschwitz, some of the Jews were dead because of the conditions of the train ride. And some of them, of course, were older Jews who were not in great health to begin with. So it's not surprising that they did not all survive the train. Once they got to Auschwitz, some were killed shortly after arrival because they were not considered worth keeping alive. The only reason to keep Jews alive was so they could do work for the Nazi government. And they did work of various sorts. You may have heard that a German officer stood at the end of the ramp when they got to Auschwitz and pointed a Jew coming towards him, either to the left or the right. To the left meant death, to the right meant survival for a while so they could work. So that's the general picture. Now, I'm going to talk to you more specifically about what happened to me and to my parents. I was born in Paris in September 1937, almost exactly 2 years before the start of World War II. World War II began on September 3rd, technically, or September 1. September 1, 1939 is the date the Germans invaded Poland. September 3rd, 1939 is the date that England and France declared war on Germany because they had treaties with Poland, self-defense treaties. So I was born in 1937. My parents were Polish immigrants. My mother came from Warsaw, the capital. My father came from a small town near the Soviet border that nobody ever heard of, Kozhangodak. I'm sure you've never heard of it. And there's no reason why you would have. Tiny little town. When did my parents come to France? I don't know. Probably between the two world wars. They were born in 1907. So when the war started, they were 32 years old. I think they probably met in Paris, although I don't know that for a fact. I know for a fact they were married in Paris because I have a copy of their marriage certificate. They had a civil marriage in the local town hall near where we lived. We lived in the northern part of Paris, near Montmartre. Some of you may know that name, near the Sacré-Cœur, famous tourist attraction. And they lived, and we lived, I should say, my parents and I, we lived in a Jewish neighborhood, a self-styled ghetto of Jewish immigrants. You heard Yiddish in the street, a lot more than you heard French. And I want to show you what my parents looked like when they were married. This one, there's no way I can turn upside down. This is my father, Wolf, and my mother, Mala, M-A-L-A. My mother actually had 3 different names depending on who she was talking to. Mala was her legal name. That's the name she was given on legal papers. Malka was her Jewish name. Malka means queen in Hebrew. And Malcha was her Yiddish name, which is I guess the Yiddish equivalent. You have to remember that like Polish immigrants, they spoke to each other in Yiddish most of the time. They were married in 1936. They were then 29, and they look happy because it's their wedding day. They didn't know they had only 6 more years to live. My father was arrested in a street roundup in our neighborhood on August 21st, 1941, by the French police, of course. Whether my parents ever actually registered when they were required to do so, I do not know. Most Jews did, because most Jews were law-abiding, and they, of course, did not know, with the benefit of hindsight, what the purpose of this was. Some smelled a rat and didn't register, but most did. Whether my parents did, I do not know. But anyway, my father was arrested, as I say, on August 21st, 1941, and he was sent to Drancy, and he spent the next 11 months there. Drancy was not a summer camp, it wasn't pleasant. But people usually managed to survive until they were deported. He was deported on July 19th, 1942 to Auschwitz on train number 7, which left Drancy. In other words, it was the 7th train that went to Auschwitz from Drancy. He was killed very shortly after he arrived there. And that was what happened to my father. I continued to live with my mother in our little apartment. It was a very small apartment, basically a 1-room apartment, as I remember it. The bathroom was down the hall. You know, this was 1940. You didn't have modern conveniences very much. French police knocked on our door on July 23rd, 1942. This is one of the few actual memories I have of that time period. And I guess because my mother must have been upset, and I guess it made an impression on me, I'm guessing. I was then about 4.5 years old, 4.5, I guess. The French police came in and they arrested my mother. They did not arrest me, even though I was right there. They would have had no problem taking me with them. And for many years, I puzzled over that. Why did they not take me as well as my mother? I couldn't figure it out. I hypothesized different things. Maybe the policeman felt sorry for me because I was a little kid. I was 4. Maybe some other reason. After many years, I have reached a conclusion as to why I wasn't arrested. And it goes back to what I was telling you earlier about the rhythm of arrestations, of arrests. First, foreign Jewish men, then foreign Jewish women, then entire families. And I think I just missed that third step. I want to mention something that is well known by any historian of the French Holocaust, and that is the biggest set of arrest of Jews, which took place a week before my mother was arrested. On July 16th, 1942, what is referred to as the Vélodrome d'hiver rafle, or in English you'd call it the Bicycling Sports Center Roundup. As you may know, the French love bicycle races. The Tour de France, you may have heard of, is something that happens in France every year and is observed in many countries. It's very popular. Not this year, for obvious reasons, but almost every year. Well, in the wintertime, the French still like to go on bicycle races, and they would do so in this inner bicycle stadium, which was in Paris. Well, on July 16, 1942, again at the request of the Germans, French police arrested 13,000 Jews, all foreign Jews. And they arrested entire families. Interestingly, from my research, I know that the Germans had said, you don't have to arrest any Jew who is under 16. I assume because they weren't ready for that level of arrest. They didn't want too many French protests. But the French government was perfectly willing to arrest Jewish children. And they said, it's fine, we will arrest all families, including children, because we don't want to leave them by themselves. So we'll, for humanitarian, quote unquote, reasons, we'll arrest them. The Vichy government was not particularly pro-Jewish. In fact, I know from what I've read, and I believe it, that Marshal Pétain, the head of the Vichy regime, was convinced that Germany was going to win the war. And he had good reason to believe it. Remember, he was a soldier. He knew about military affairs. At that time, it certainly looked like the Germans could win the war. It was not hard to believe. And therefore, Pétain and his government said, well, if the Germans want to let us have a government and be a decent country, if all that takes is to arrest Jews, well, okay, we'll do that. We can sacrifice the Jews and we'll be a French government and we'll survive. I think that was his point of view. And therefore, the French government even anticipated Germans, as they did on this occasion, by allowing even small children to be arrested. And about 4,000 children were indeed arrested out of that 13,000. And almost all of them died in Auschwitz, almost every one of them. So remember, this happened on July 16th, 1942. The French police knocked on the door of my mother's apartment on the 23rd, exactly 1 week later. So the fact that I wasn't arrested was I would say, a very close call. had they come to arrest my mother a couple of weeks later, I believe they would have taken me along with my mother, and I wouldn't be talking to you. I'd be dead. I wouldn't have survived, I'm quite sure. So it was an accident of timing, I believe, that I'm still alive to talk to you. Once my mother was arrested, she was, of course, taken to Drancy, just like all Jews arrested in Paris. But she only spent 6 days there, unlike my father. She was deported on train number 12 on July 29th, 1942. And she also only survived in Auschwitz a few days before she was killed. Now, a natural question you may wonder is, well, what happened to me? My mother was gone. I was 4 years old. What does a 4-year-old do? All I can tell you is that I wound up at the apartment of my father's sister, my aunt, who lived in the same apartment building where we lived. She lived in a different apartment with her husband, and somehow I wound up with her. I don't know how I got there. I have no memory of that. I'm guessing that a neighbor took me there, but I don't know exactly how I got there. My aunt, by the way, survived the war. She was never arrested, although I think she had something close to a nervous breakdown because of all that happened. And my aunt would never talk to me about the war. She refused. So even though she knew more than anybody about what happened to me and my parents, she never wanted to talk about it. That would make her very nervous and upset, and she just didn't want to talk about it. I think this was not an uncommon reaction to Jews who survived the war. I think many of them felt that way, didn't want to talk about it. What I know, I found out many years later through research that I did. My aunt decided that I should not remain in Paris. It was too dangerous, and I think she was right. I would probably have eventually have been arrested had I stayed in Paris. So she arranged with a Jewish agency. It was called WIZO, W-I-Z-O, which is the acronym for Women's International Zionist Organization. This was an organization of Jewish women who did a lot of social work. And during World War II, they gave themselves the mission of hiding Jewish children who were orphaned. And so my aunt apparently worked out with them that I should leave Paris, and they found a Catholic family in Brittany, which is an area of France in northwestern France, for me to be with. And I went there to this little farm, which this couple had in a little town in Brittany. And I had to have a different name. Why did my name have to change? Because only Jews were called Nathan. That's actually my name. Nat is my nickname. Nathan was only a Jewish name, so I obviously could not keep it. So I was called Pierre, good Christian name, means Peter in English, or stone, and that's what Peter means. Peter means stone. So I was Pierre. I stayed with this farm couple in Brittany for about 2.5 years, from, I don't know the exact date, but sometime after my mother was taken, in July probably, or early August, I'm not sure, until early 1945, when D-Day had occurred and France had been liberated, and it was safe for me to come back to Paris, and I came back to be with my aunt. I have only one photo of my stay in this, on this farm, which I will show you. This is a blow-up of the actual photo, which is a lot smaller, but I wanted you to be able to see it. This is the farm couple, and this is me, the little kid here. I'm still not very tall, but I was a really short little kid in those days. Do you notice anything unusual about the man? I think if I call your attention, you should notice what I'm talking about. You notice at the end of his arm is a hook. He had lost his right arm apparently during a farm accident of some sort. And in the 1940s, they didn't have modern surgery to recreate a hand. So that's what people had when they didn't have a hand. They had a hook. Scared the hell out of me the first time I saw it. But the couple was nice to me. They took care of me. They even made me a pair of wooden shoes, which in French are called sabots, S-A-B-O-T-S. The word sabotage comes from sabot. Sabotage originally meant that in the Middle Ages, when the peasants were unhappy with the prices they got for their grain, they would take their wooden shoes and throw them into the machinery. So they would break up the machinery. And that's where the word sabotage comes from. Kind of an interesting origin. So I came back to be with my aunt in early 1945. Unfortunately, although I didn't know it, she had developed breast cancer and she was too sick to keep me. So she arranged with another Jewish organization called OSE, O-S-E. It stands for three French words, Œuvre de Secours aux Enfants, which means Organization for Helping Children, which was originally created in Russia, but eventually became a French organization. And during World War II and after, created a number of orphanages for people in my situation. So I spent another year or so, about a year or two, in a couple of different of this organization's orphanages. And then at the end, when the war was officially over, around 1946, end 45, 46, my aunt took me back briefly. She had, in the meantime, asked her sister, another of my father's sisters, who had gone from Poland directly to the United States before the war started. So she was never involved in what happened to Jews during the war. This other aunt, my Aunt Esther, that was her name, lived in New York City. And my French aunt, my Aunt Sonia, asked her if she would take me to live with her because she couldn't keep me and she didn't want me to stay in orphanages. So my American aunt, whom I had never met, agreed. And my French aunt took me down to the south of France, to the Mediterranean, to the city of Cannes, put me on a boat and waved goodbye to me. And I crossed the ocean by myself to reach New York City. I arrived in New York City on May 4th, 1948. My aunt and uncle in New York, of course, spoke no French. I spoke no English. I had never met them before, and I was totally confused. The first thing they did was buy me a French-English, English-French dictionary. Even though I had not gone to school, except very briefly at the end of the war, I could read and write French. I was 10 years old at the time. With this dictionary, I could communicate. They called me ça veut dire at home. Why did they call me ça veut dire? Because every time they would say something to me in English, I would say in French, qu'est-ce que ça veut dire? Which means, what does that mean? So the only part of that sentence they could say was ça veut dire. So I became known as ça veut dire. And of course, the rest of my life in the US is a fairly normal, uneventful life. I learned English, obviously. My aunt and uncle did not learn French. I went to school, high school in New York City. I went to City College in New York, got an undergraduate degree. I got a graduate degree from Middlebury College in French. I got a PhD in French from Columbia University. And I started teaching French until people no longer studied French. Who majors in French today, and why would they? I'm waiting for an answer. I don't think I'm going to get one. So I had to do something else. So at the age of 37, I went back to school, by which time I was married, had a child. Luckily, I had a wife who worked. And I took an aptitude test at Virginia Tech, and they told me to be a librarian. I said, I don't want to be a librarian. They said, well, in that case, become an accountant. They said, you could do accounting. You're suited for that. You're disciplined, you're organized. You would do okay in accounting. So I said, fine. Accounting is something you can get a job in. And I got a degree in accounting. I got a CPA certificate. They told me I was the first person in Virginia to become a CPA who had a PhD in French. And I believe it. It's not a very common combination. And I taught accounting from then on. So that's the story of my life. Let's see how much time we got. It's probably time for questions. I have lots more I could tell you about how I found out all the things I know. And I can talk about that if people are interested in knowing how I learned the various dates of my parents' imprisonment and what happened to them. I also wanted to say a word, and I guess I should say that before going on. I want to say a word or two about the Klarsfelds. Serge Klarsfeld and his wife, Beate. I owe a lot to them. They were Nazi hunters. Serge Klarsfeld was a French Jew born in 1935. He's still alive today. He's 2 years older than I am. He's 84. His wife, Beate, was a German Protestant. She came to France in her early 20s to be an au pair. Do you know what that is? An au pair is a kind of nanny to children. A lot of foreign young women did that to earn money and also to travel. So a lot of young women did that. And she did that. She met Serge on a subway platform in Paris. He liked the looks of her. He took her out and married her. Klarsfeld was, his father was killed at Auschwitz, just like mine was. And Serge became an attorney and a Holocaust historian of the French Holocaust. He's written a number of books. One of the books he wrote was this one. I have the English edition because I couldn't get the French one. I would have liked to get the French one. In 1978, the French edition came out, Memorial to the Jews Deported from France, 1942, 1944. Klarsfeld found one of the 4 copies of the list of Jews on every one of the trains that went from Drancy to Auschwitz. You remember I mentioned the Judenrat, the Jewish Council? Well, the French Jewish Council got one of those copies, and he found that in some cardboard box in one of their attic storage areas. And he published that in the form of a book. And I actually found the names of my parents in that book, which really floored me when I saw their names, because I figured out, and I don't have the time to explain to you how I found this out, but I figured out that, because I want to leave time for questions, I figured out which train they had been on. And when I got a copy of this book, and it lists the names of the Jews. For example, here's the train that my father was on. This is perhaps too small for you to read. I don't know if you can read this, but you see next to the red arrow is my father's name, Kranowski Wolf, and it gives his date of birth. And in Europe, you give the day before you give the month. So the day, the month, the year. And then they give the place of birth, and they give a name that I've never understood, David Arondov. That sounds like German to me. Dorf means town or village in German. Actually, I know that he was born in Kojangodak. Maybe the Germans gave it that name. I have no idea where that came from. And then they give nationality, and this is from the French list, IND, indéterminé, which means unknown. And probably the reason it's unknown is that it was on the Russian border, and that part of Poland changed hands a number of times. So they weren't sure whether he was Polish or Russian or what. And then I have a similar one from my mother. Let's see if I can show you this. Yeah, there she is. Kranowski Mala. It's a little hard here for me to look at this when I'm in back of it. I'm sorry. I'm doing the best I can here. Here we go. It's on the left side. Yeah, I had the wrong side for you. Perhaps you can see that my mother's name is there, Kranowski Mala. And in her case, they know she was Polish because she was born in Warsaw. Varsovie is Warsaw in French. All right, that's probably enough talking on my part. Now I'll be happy to try to answer any questions you have.
Grant, do you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you for sharing everything, Matt. Several people kind of asked us this question in different ways, but how did you've alluded a little bit through your conversation about the historical records from France, but how did you learn about your own story? What inspired you to look into it? In particular, we actually have one student whose grandfather was born in Paris in 1939. And so he didn't know much of his time there. And so several people have kind of asked that question now.
Well, for many years, I didn't do anything about finding out. I did not know what had happened to my parents. I suspected they were deceased, but I had no idea under what circumstances. I mean, I was pretty sure it was something to do with the Nazis, but I didn't know how or when even. I became interested in this question seriously when our first son was born. We have two sons. Our first son, Stephen, was born in 1970. And at that time, I was 33 years old. And I said, you know, I really ought to try to find out because I want to be able to tell my son about our family. And that's really what motivated me. Now, as to how I found out, I don't want to go into too much detail because that would take a good while, but you know, it didn't happen in 5 minutes. You know, it took quite a while before I really found out a lot. This is the first thing that I got that gave me some clues. This is a copy of two cards I got from the French government, from the French equivalent of the Veterans Administration. And the Victims of War was part of the French Veterans Administration at that time. In fact, I think it still is. I got, in 1962, when I was 25 years old, at which point I was still single, I got a copy of each of those two cards. I'm showing you a copy that I made of those two cards. I still have them. One for my father and one for my mother. My aunt got them at the last known address of me and my parents, which was in Paris. And luckily, she still lived there. And she was able to get, she got these because the concierge, the person who got the mail, knew the name and knew that it had something to do with my aunt. So she gave it to her and she mailed them to me back in '62. And this is all in French, but I know French quite well, so I had no trouble reading it. But I was mystified because I give you a translation of the two major lines of the cards. For my father, it says interned, August 21, 1941 to July 18th, 1942. Well, I understood that. It meant he was in prison someplace. I didn't know where, of course, because it didn't say on the card. And then the next line said deported from July 19th, 1942. That's the day after the imprisonment, you see, to July, what's that day? 24, I think it is, 1942. And that puzzled me. Where was he deported to? And what happened on July 24th, 1942? The card didn't say, of course. And I had similar information from my mother. So I scratched my head and couldn't figure it out. When I got the book of Serge Klarsfeld that I showed you a minute ago, the Memorial to the Jews Departed, I had a sudden flash of inspiration. I said, wait a minute, my father was deported on July 19th. What if he was deported to Auschwitz on one of those trains? So I looked to see, was there a train that left Drancy on July 19th? Yes, there was. It was train number 7. And the people listed there were listed in alphabetical order. And I almost fell over when I saw my father's name on that page. And of course, I figured out the same thing for my mother. So those two cards and Serge's book is what allowed me to know what happened to my parents. And that book is as close to a cemetery as I can visit for my parents. I have that book. I wish I had it in French, but I couldn't get it in French. I got it only in English, but okay. And that's where I copied the pages I showed you a few minutes ago. I have other books that Klarsfeld wrote. He has a 2-volume work called Vichy Auschwitz, which gives very detailed information about what happened to Jews in France during the war. And thanks to reading those books, they only exist in French. You can't get them in English. But I read French just as well as I read English, so it's not a problem for me. I figured out when my father was undoubtedly arrested, August 21, 1942. It made perfect sense because that was the date, you remember on the card I showed you, that he was arrested on August 21. And in Klarsfeld's Vichy Auschwitz book, I saw that there were arrests in my neighborhood, the 18th district of Paris, which is where we live, on that date. So it makes perfect sense to believe that he was arrested on that date in that place. And that's how I figured things out. It was like a puzzle, you know, figuring things out one after the other. I also want to mention something very briefly, because I want to give you a chance to ask more questions. I mentioned that I wanted to talk a little bit about, very briefly, the Memorial De La Shoah, which is located in central Paris, because my parents' names are engraved on its wall. This is the wall, or one of the walls, at this memorial. It's about 10 feet tall, at least. Maybe you can see by the size of the man that it's pretty tall. There are several of these walls, and engraved in stone are the names of everyone listed in the 75 trains that went from Drancy to Auschwitz by year, and then alphabetically. So here I am in 2006, making a rubbing of my parents' names at that wall. The wall, the memorial was created in 2005 because for the first time, the French government admitted complicity in what happened to the Jews. President Jacques Chirac was the first French president to admit that the French had a role in the Holocaust. No other French president would admit it. He was the first. And he was there when this memorial was created in 2005. Okay, any other questions?
I got a question asking sort of about how you were able to rebuild your life in the US and if you were able to meet other children or orphans from the Holocaust when you were living in New York.
No, I was not. I lived with my aunt and uncle, as I explained, and I associated with the kids in our neighborhood. We lived in the Bronx. That's where my aunt lived when I first lived with her. Later, we moved to Queens. And we had a little United Nations. We had Italian kids of Italian background, Jewish background, Irish background. The only thing we didn't have were African Americans or Latinos. Our neighborhood was lily white. So no, I did not really meet with any others. I might mention very briefly that in 2012, this photo of me, let's see, where is it? Here it is. This photo of me appeared on the Holocaust Memorial Museum of Washington, D.C., along with about 1,000 other Jewish orphans. At the end of the war, Jewish social agencies went around to orphanages taking the photos of the kids there to see if they could identify family that could take them. And although I have no memory of this, obviously my picture was taken because here I am. I know that's me, I'm quite sure of it. A professor in France, in the little town where I had been hidden, had been researching Jewish kids hidden in his area. There were about 30. I was one. And when he saw this photo of me, he had been trying to find me to tell me what he knew. And he couldn't find me because I was in the United States. He had no notion of where I was. He didn't know how to get in touch with me. But when he saw this photo, he contacted the museum and asked if he could contact me. And they asked my permission, as they should. And I said, sure. So he wrote me in French because he didn't know English. He only knew French. And he told me where I was hidden. And he proved it to me that it wasn't a hoax by showing me a photo of my parents, the same photo I showed you earlier, this wedding photo that he had gotten from a Jewish agency. And that created bona fides as far as I was concerned. And he said, if you want to come to France, you can stay with me and I will take you to the farm where you were hidden, which of course I didn't know where it was. So in 2012, Muriel, my wife, and I went to France. We went to this little town in Brittany, stayed with this former professor of history who was doing this research. And he took us to this farm. I didn't recognize it because it had been converted into a single family home, although they had kept one wall of the original farm, which I did recognize as a type of wall that I remembered. And I met with the family that lived there, very nice people who received us extremely well. They asked me to give a talk about what happened to me in the town hall. It was the first time I gave a talk in French on the subject. I always gave the talk in English in America here, but I did it. And I still keep in touch with that family. They're really nice folks. And in fact, their daughter, who is a high school student, and we communicate every week by email because she wanted to stay in touch with me. Very sweet girl. And she tells me what she's doing in school. For a while, we were communicating in English because she was learning English, but she got tired of it because it was too difficult for her. So she says, can we communicate only in French? I said, sure. And that's what we do now. So that's the story. Any other questions?
Yeah, we have one. So it's, hi, this is Julie Blitz's dad. Julie's one of the students. So we have a lot of people listening who may not even be all the participants listed. Thank you for telling your story. Current events are putting a spotlight on mental health in our community as we are all trying to cope with the pandemic. Can you share how the act of telling your story has helped you and others cope with what you, your family, and your community went through 80 years ago?
Well, for one thing, as I've told you, there's no cemetery I can go to for my parents, and I want to keep the memory of my parents alive. And the best way I can do this is by telling this story. I always feel good right after I finish telling my story to a new group of people. It makes me feel good because it's a way of honoring my parents. There are not too many things I can do to memorialize them, and this is something I can do. And there apparently are not too many people who have today actual knowledge of the Holocaust from their own experience. So I get requests every year, several times a year, to speak to groups, and I never say no, I always accept. Again, for the reasons I said, it's in honor of my parents, and it also makes me feel good. It makes me feel that I'm doing something worthwhile. I don't know what relationship it has with the pandemic, to be honest with you. I'm not sure I see one, but all I can tell you is what I just said.
The only last question that I have was from my mother, and it says, do you remember if your mom and dad celebrated Shabbat when you were younger?
I have no idea. I was 4 years old the last time I saw one of my parents. I don't even know if they were religious. I know they were Jewish because I know the family background. Whether they were religious, I do not know. I can't tell you. There's a lot I don't know.
And just to clarify, you were able to visit the farmhouse that you stayed in, but were you able to actually meet that family who kept?
Unfortunately, no. That's a good question. They were older. You could see in the photo that they were not a young couple, I think. I don't know how old they were, I can't tell you. But they left the area, you know, this professor who lived in the area connected me with one or two others who knew this couple who lived in the area, because he personally did not know them, but there were some locals who did, two men in particular whom I met while we were there in 2012. And by the way, everyone received us very well. All the Catholic, because Brittany is very Catholic, just like most of France traditionally is Catholic. Protestants are a minority in France. Received us very well. I was really very touched by how nice they were to us and how sympathetic they were to me and to the Jews. So the two people that I met who knew this couple said that near the end of the war, they left the area and they lost contact with them. So I don't know what happened to them. I could never meet them. And I'm sure by now they're deceased. I'm certain they must be. I know their name. And that's all I know. I know their last name, Fouchet, which, you know, is not much in the way of knowledge.
Let's see. We have a few more questions. Samantha, do you want to?
There's actually a follow-up question about the family in Brittany. It says, with regards, was it traumatizing at all when you went to visit these places, or was it a rather cathartic? Like, how did you feel when you were going to visit?
Okay. It was very emotional for me. It was like going to a holy land, you might say. I never thought in my life that I would find out where that farm was. Even now, I choke up when I think about it. Excuse me, but I find that difficult. I don't know what to say.
Well, thank you for sharing still.
Yeah, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome. As I say, it does at least as much for me as it may do for others, maybe more.
We have a few more questions rolling in.
I'm willing to answer more questions. If you
Yeah,
have more questions.
they're coming in still. One individual asked, "How do you know what happened to your parents in Auschwitz?"
I actually do not. Oh, all right. Actually, I do. Because I take the word of the French government. I'll explain. If you can't trust the French government, who can you trust, right? So I will. This is a very good question that the person asked, and I have an answer, which I think is a good answer. One of the things that President Chirac, the French president, around 2000 did was through his cabinet to create a pension for people who were orphaned, like I was, because the French government sent French Jews to Auschwitz, where they died. So I found out that I could get a pension from the French government if I applied, which I did. And like French bureaucracy, they had a lot of forms for me to fill out. One of the forms stumped me. It said, we need a death certificate for your parents. Needless to say, the Germans did not give death certificates to anybody. So I was stumped. I said, well, what am I supposed to do? So I wrote back to them and I said, there's no way I can give you a death certificate. What am I supposed to do? So they said, they sent me this. They said, this will act in lieu of a death certificate. This is a page taken from the French equivalent of the congressional record that we have in the US. In other words, it's a record of all laws that were passed by the French Congress. And this was in 1995 that a law was passed which listed all the Jews that went from Drancy to Auschwitz. And it said it in French, and I translated it so that you would know what it says, because I don't expect you to read French. So for example, you see in highlighted green, these are my parents' names, and this is what it says in the highlighted portion. So for my mother, it has one for my mother and one for my father. For my mother, it says Kranowski, born Same, that was her maiden name, Mala, first name, May 1, 1907, her birth date, in Warsaw, Poland, died August 3rd, 1942, in Auschwitz, Poland, and not July 29, 1942 in Drancy. Now, why do you think they put it that way? I think I know the answer, do you? Why do they say, and not July 29th? Why do they say that? To me, the answer is obvious. They don't want to be responsible for the death of my mother. They want to say, she didn't die in France. It's the Germans that did it in Auschwitz. We didn't do it. In 1995, the French were not admitting any responsibility, but there were already rumors that the French had a role in the Holocaust. And this was the French Congress's way of saying, hey, we're not responsible. And therefore, what I'm telling you is I took the French government's word that my father died on that day. I assume, this is an assumption on my part, but I think a reasonable one, that he didn't just keel over and die, that he was gassed. By the way, when he got to Auschwitz, train number 7 was the first set of Jews who were gassed in Auschwitz. That was the first time that happened. So, no, I do not know for a fact how my parents died. I'm making an assumption. but I think it's a reasonable one. It's very difficult to know everything about these happenings. And to the best of my knowledge, that's what I believe.
Have you ever encountered anti-Semitism or Holocaust deniers in your career or life in whole? And how have you dealt with it if you have?
I have not personally, but I have read plenty about anti-Semitism. I have never personally experienced it. I've been fortunate, I think. France is one of the more anti-Semitic countries, I'm afraid I have to say. I have very mixed feelings about France. On the one hand, I like France because I love French language and literature. If I had my choice, I would have retired a French professor. But the demand wasn't there, and I didn't get tenure in my last post at Holland, so I had to do something else, and I told you what I did. So there's a lot I like about France, but given that even today, anti-Semitism is stronger than ever in France. If I was in France today, I would not dare to walk around Paris with a yarmulke on my head. That would be asking for being attacked. And those Jews who do often are, as if you read the news, you perhaps know. So anti-Semitism is getting stronger, unfortunately, today. It's increasing. One reason it is so dangerous in France is that there is a tremendous number of North African Muslims who hate Israel and therefore hate all Jews. There are approximately 10 million Muslims in France today. They are the most numerous of any Western European country, I believe. Number of Jews in France currently is approximately 600,000. Again, 1% of the population, which is currently about 66 million in France. So we are back where we started in terms of Jews as a percent of French population. So although I have not experienced anti-Semitism, I am not optimistic about anti-Semitism in the world, and certainly not in France. It's not a good situation in France. It's increasing in this country too, because the rightists are getting stronger in this country. And when the rightists get stronger, anti-Semitism follows. In fact, I have read recently that Jews are being blamed for the coronavirus. The old story, Jews are scapegoats. You don't blame yourself, you always blame somebody else. And Jews are an easy target.
So one of the questions is kind of interesting, you mentioning all this. After all you have been through, are you religious and are spiritual?
Yes. Part of the reason I attribute to my wife, Muriel, who I think is looking on here. Muriel, my wife, is religious. In fact, she conducts services at our synagogue along with my son, Stephen, quite regularly. My aunt and uncle in New York were not religious at all. My uncle was what I would call a once-a-year Jew, and I think you know what that means. High holidays, he would go to synagogue. Other than that, never. My aunt never set foot in the synagogue as long as I've known her. She's deceased now, as is my uncle, of course, because they were older. But they were not religious. My aunt, I learned Yiddish because my aunt and uncle spoke Yiddish. And I just picked it up. You know, I don't speak it fluently, but I know it fairly. It helped when I had to learn German for my PhD, because Yiddish and German are related. But my aunt and uncle were not Jewish. In fact, I did not know I was Jewish before I came to America. How would I know? I had no way of knowing. I didn't even know what being Jewish meant when I came to America. I became Jewish after I got married because my wife was Jewish, and also because once I learned about my parents, I felt this was another way to honor them. And I don't know how spiritual I am. I don't know how religious I am, but I go to synagogue when I can every Shabbat. My wife and I go every Shabbat, we never miss. I think I've missed maybe once in 10 years. And I know the service by heart, pretty much. Not that I know what all the words mean, I'm not a Hebrew speaker, but I do know the service quite well. We read the Torah, every week, and we read it every year. As you know, you start over every year, it's a cycle. So I've become knowledgeable. My wife knows a lot more than I do. I give a lot of credit to her. She's very knowledgeable, and she's probably turning red right now, but she deserves the praise. She's really great. She knows a lot because she's worked hard at it.
Do we have any more questions, Grant?
Yeah, we got a few more. Yeah, so I mean, now we've got a few more. If you're interested, we can keep that.
I'll keep answering as long as people want.
Yeah, we can answer questions. We're gonna probably take maybe three or so questions, and then we can wrap up. Okay. So with that in mind, so going back to your story, what risks did the family take in hiding you? What do you think were some of those risks?
Well, this is a many-faceted question. Number one, obviously, I mean, it's perfectly obvious what the basic risk is. Hiding a Jewish child could get you killed if you were not Jewish. So that's certainly a risk. Having said that, there were a couple of other things I want to say about my particular situation with that family. Number one, they were poor and they were paid by WIZO, this Jewish organization, to keep me. They were paid for my expenses, you might say. I'm not saying this is the only reason they did it, and I don't know what their motivation was. I cannot tell you. Remember, I was a little kid, I didn't understand very much what was going on. Also, once in a while, German soldiers would come by. They would put a pack of cigarettes on the kitchen table and say the word "uff," pronounced the German way, which means eggs. They wanted some eggs. So of course you didn't refuse. There they were with the guns slung on their shoulder and their big German shepherd, who scared the heck out of me, by the way. And they put the cigarettes down, and without waiting for an answer, they would go to the chicken coop and pick up eggs and leave, and they never questioned my presence. I don't know why they didn't question my presence, but they had no particular reason to, I suppose. So that's another aspect of this. Third, I found out from this professor of history who I visited in 2012 that the local French police and the local citizens, they knew pretty well that they were Jewish kids being hidden with some Christian families in the area, but they were sympathetic and they did not betray them. So they weren't taking as great a risk as one might believe, perhaps. This is all I can tell you on the subject, but I repeat that the people in Brittany amazed me by how sympathetic they were towards Jews, even though they were Catholic. And I must say that I was very prejudiced against French Catholics before I went there. And this is, my own weakness. I thought, because many French Catholics were anti-Semitic. That certainly was true. I know that for a fact. But not all, by any means. They varied. Some were anti-Semitic and some took risks protecting Jews. And I am no longer as prejudiced as I was. I hope I'm not prejudiced at all, but I can't swear to it.
Do you know if that family who do you know their last name, is listed as righteous among the nations?
No, in fact, I tried to get them listed And they asked me too much information about them that I could not answer, so they refused. I mean, for example, they wanted to know, why did they take me in? Well, I don't know. I was 4 years old. What do I know? They want to know other stuff, and I couldn't answer. I answered as best as I could, but that was not satisfactory.
And then also, in terms of family, again, I'm going to ask these two questions because they're very similar. One is, do you know if your parents met again in Auschwitz prior to their passing? And then also, your grandparents in Poland, did you ever know them or see them, and did you know their fate?
The answer is no, probably, to both of your questions. I doubt very much that my parents met in Auschwitz. For one thing, men and women were separated. They were not housed in the same cell blocks. And although my parents were there almost at the same time in Auschwitz, they were not there exactly at the same time. So I doubt very much that they met. That seems impossible. What was the second question again?
The second question was about your family and your grandparents in Poland.
All right.
Did you ever know them or see them, and
No.
did you ever know their fate?
In fact, I have a photo that you might like to see, which is kind of interesting. This is a copy of a photo taken, I believe, around 1912. 1912. My father is the small boy in front with the blondish hair holding a ball. Do you see him? A round ball, I think it is. That's my father. And I say 1912 because I know he was born in 1907, and he appears to be about 5 years old, I'm guessing. Here, it's hard to do this backwards here. Let's see if I can do this.
The taller person is on your left side.
Yeah. The smaller person on the extreme left is my Paris aunt, who basically saved my life, I suppose, by sending me into hiding. And on the extreme right is the mother of my cousin, who is still alive and who has a similar story to mine. He and his parents lived across the street from me in Paris. He was at this Vélodrome d'hiver, a roundup, which I mentioned during my talk. And he survived because he got appendicitis during the time he was at this Vélodrome d'hiver. And he was taken to a hospital, and a relative who was, this is amazing, a relative who was hired by the Germans to make fur-lined clothing for German troops, and who therefore had a permit to enter any place she wanted to. She entered the hospital and smuggled my cousin out and saved his life. He is now he is 8 years older than I am, so he's 90 years old. He's living in Connecticut near his daughter. And he's the one who gave me this photo, by the way. I don't know how he got it, but he gave me this photo. Isn't this an amazing photo?
It's wonderful, yeah.
I find it quite remarkable.
All right, I think that concludes our questions, because we may still be getting them, but I don't want to keep you too much longer.
Okay, well, you're in charge. You do what you need to do.
Yeah, the last question we have is just simply put, what I shouldn't phrase it that way. What are your thoughts about the state of Israel?
I think we're lucky to have the state of Israel, and it's more than luck. It's the fact that the Jews who created Israel were amazing people. And the fact that this small group of Jews fought off, I don't know how many thousands or millions of Arabs, is a miracle. How did they do it? I don't understand it, but they did. Israel is the most modern country in Israel. I think the Jews, the Sabras, you know, the Jews who were born in Israel, who are Israelis, have some faults. You know, I don't know. I have never personally been to Israel, so all I know is hearsay, and you can take it for what it's worth. I think it's wonderful that we have such a country. And Israelis believe that all Jews should emigrate to Israel and live there. They think that any Jew who does not is not doing the right thing. I think that most Israelis feel that way. In fact, I have a friend whom I've known for many, many years, an American Jew who emigrated to Israel, and he's to the right of right, you might say. And he writes me and he keeps telling me, you know how President Trump is a wonderful man. And why is he a wonderful man? Well, you know the answer to that. Because he recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and because he has said very favorable things about Israel. So, you know, I have mixed feelings because I'm a liberal politically, and I'm not to the right the way I think many Israelis are. Not all, I'm sure. There are Israeli leftists who probably feel very similarly to the way I do. But as a country, Israel, perhaps it has to be that way, perhaps, to continue to exist. You know, I don't say that Israel is wrong to be that way, but it's not me. I'm not that way. I don't feel the need to live in Israel. I'm very happy to live in the United States. With all its faults, the United States is a wonderful country. And I admire the United States. Whereas I'm not sure that Israelis feel the way I do. Some do and some don't. So it's a complicated issue.
And then we have one very final question, which is, how did you end up in the Southwest Virginia area?
Well, that's a very easy answer. I've taught in a number of different colleges, and when I did not get tenure at Rutgers University in New Jersey, where I had taught for 8 years, and I didn't get tenure for a very simple reason: I didn't publish sufficiently. I'm not a publisher. I love teaching, but I'm not a researcher in the sense of publishing. And it's publish or perish. That's perfectly true in any large university. You either publish or you don't make it. And I didn't make it. So I looked around for another job, and I saw this opening at Hollins College, as it was then known, in 1970. And I went for an interview, and I liked it immediately because I went there in January and I left New Jersey, and it was snowing, it was cold, and I got off the plane in Roanoke, and it was warm and sunny, and I said, this is the place for me. And I got a job teaching at Hollins College in Roanoke, and that's what brought me to this part of the country.
Well, Nat, thank you so much for being able to chat with us during this pandemic on Zoom. Was really excited to be able to have that opportunity.
Well, you're very welcome. As I said, I always feel good after I give one of these talks, even in this kind of awkward manner, which I've never done before, and I turn documents upside down. I'm sorry about that. But I still feel good about having had this opportunity. Thank you for asking me.
Yeah.
So it's time to say goodbye.
Yes. Yeah.
Everyone whom I don't see, all 45 of you, for participating by listening and asking questions. I appreciate your interest. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a little weird because it's like, you know, we clap for you and people should probably are clapping right now. And it's just Sam and I you could hear from. So.
All right, I will say goodbye in French. I will say au revoir et merci infiniment de m'avoir écouté. Si vous me comprenez, c'est magnifique. Sinon, ça va. Au revoir.
Au revoir. And many people, by the way, are thanking you in the chat. If you want to look at the chat, so if
Okay.
you look at the screen, they're all heading out, but they're saying thanks.
Yes, I see that. Thank you.
Yeah, and everyone, thank you so much for joining us this evening to spend time with us. We really appreciate it, and everyone have a great rest of the week.
Same to you, and stay safe and well, everybody. Goodbye.
Bye, Nat. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. I'm going to sign off now. Bye.
Yeah, I'm ending it for everyone. Bye.